Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This is number 3 on the series of the history of two cultures. What we're looking at is how culture influences the thinking processes. What were the major cultures? What we've looked at is that there exists a Western culture, and that means there exists non-Western cultures. What we're looking at and getting into right now is the non-Western culture. And what we've gone over is up to now is the non-Western culture selecting the Hebrew nation as being that non-Western culture. And what was their source of reliable knowledge? Their source was their God, as he revealed himself through special revelation, communicating directly to his prophets and to people in special events, or through general revelation, which was through that which has been created, through which he had created. Now we're looking at, what they were commanded to observe the Sabbath. That was a pattern set by their God because of his work week, his creation, that he works creating 6 days and rested on the 7th. And he called the 7th the Sabbath day. And that day was to be holy, which means separated off from the normal week. And so they were commanded through Moses that they were to observe a Sabbath day of the week. So they were to work 6 days, and on the 7th day they were to withdraw and separate themselves from the normal routine of life, and they were to separate themselves onto their God, recognizing their God on that day. Now, they were later instructed in Leviticus to not only observe a Sabbath of a weekday, but they were to observe a Sabbath every 7 years, which would mean giving their land a year of rest. They were an agricultural society, and they depended upon their planting, their harvesting season, and for sustenance. So what God was asking them to do was to trust him and show that trust and allegiance to him by letting the land rest on the 7th year. Every 7 years they were to observe a Sabbath unto the Lord. This is what the instructions that were given to the Israelites, the Hebrews, as they were leaving Egypt, being delivered from Egypt by Moses. They were giving instructions of how to maintain their cultural purity, how to maintain their worship, how to do things, and that is what they were to cultivate, these habits which would form a cultural pattern of doing things. And one of the most important things that was emphasized was purity, was separation. God was always telling them to separate themselves, to be separate, to worship only him, he and him only, to separate themselves from the world 1 day a week, then to separate their land from cultivation every 7 years, 1 year out of every 7. That was and so what God commanded from his people, or wanted from his people, was separation from the normal cultures of the world. They were to maintain a purity. To maintain that purity, they were also commanded to not intermarry with other cultures. They were not to intermarry because he knew that would bring in foreign gods, foreign thinking, foreign processes. And so he had commanded them, you are not to intermarry. You are not to exchange cultural customs. You're not to adopt the gods from the other lands of which they were then conquering. And it came with a warning. Joshua, chapter 24, verse 20. Joshua has brought them in to the promised land. He has delivered them, but now he gives them a warning. And he says, if you forsake Yahweh and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you evil and consume you after he has done you good. He did them good by delivering them from the powerful nation of Egypt in the 1400s. They then went 100 years or so in the desert, 40 years, because of disobedience. And the people that did not believe God or did not trust Him were died out in the desert. Then 40 years later, or at the end of the wandering of 40 years, now they get to the edge of the promised land, and Moses cannot enter because of disobedience. Joshua takes them in, and Joshua is part of the delivery process of which they conquered all these great cultures around them. But with the warning then Joshua gives is that if you forsake Yahweh and you serve these foreign gods that are all around us, then He will turn and do you evil. So in other words, the God that has delivered them from Egypt, now from all these surrounding cultures and nations, He is saying, be careful. Follow God and follow Him only. Maintain your separation. Maintain your belief in a one God. Maintain your cultural purity. The Hebrews were commanded to conserve their cultural ways and to be faithful to their God. Monotheism, one God, where the other cultures had many gods. When they came in and conquered, the other cultures maybe adopted their God among the many gods. The Israelites were probably then tempted to adopt those gods, maybe, but they were warned, don't do that. What did they do? Well, over time, over hundreds of years, they entered the promised land. They lived from probably about the 1300s, maybe early 1400s, in the promised land. They lived very well. They were secure. They maintained their purity. And while they did maintain their purity, they maintained their culture. They maintained their possession. They maintained their blessing of what their God had said He would do. But then there came a time in about 700 BC, 600 BC, where they were falling away. They began adopting different gods, different practices, different customs. And that is when their warrior nations, or the nations around them, one in particular, grew very strong and began conquering, began taking over different lands and different cultures. This is the Persian nations. The Persian nation of Babylon, of Nebuchadnezzar. He has come up now, and he's come up now against Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has shut the doors. Jerusalem is in protection mode because it knows now that it is being warred against. It is being conquered. It is going to be devastated. Jeremiah chapter 39 verses 1 and 2 says, "In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, the 9th day of the month, a breach was made in the city." So in other words, they surrounded the city. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 9th year, so it's a 9, 10, 11, for almost 3 years the Babylonians have encircled the city and cut off the supplies. They have cut off the supplies and the people have boarded themselves in, but then after the 3 years, the Babylonians have breached the wall. They have gone in. They have conquered Judah, Jerusalem. They are now deporting the people. Jeremiah chapter 40, verses 2 and 3. The captain of the guard took Jeremiah. What captain? What guard? The Babylonian captain. The Babylonian captain of the guard took Jeremiah and said to him, "Yahweh, your God, pronounced this evil on this place. And Yahweh has brought it, and done according to as He spoke, because you have sinned against Yahweh, and have not obeyed His voice. Therefore this thing has come upon you." Wow. A rebuke. The Jews, the Hebrews, are being rebuked by a Babylonian prison guard, captain of the guard. He's saying, this came upon you because you disobeyed. Was this Babylonian guard a believer in God? I don't know. Because of the personal pronouns used, he says to Jeremiah and said to him, Yahweh, your God. So he doesn't say Yahweh, my God. He says, Yahweh, your God, has brought this evil upon you because you did not observe the Sabbaths. You did not remain pure. You did not remain monotheistic. You adopted these other gods. And now all this has come upon you. So what do we have now? We have now the non-Western culture, and all the non-Western cultures have been conquered. Have been conquered by a non-Western culture, the Babylonians, the Persians. And now the non-Western culture that I have focused on, which is the Hebrew nation, which was the only monotheistic culture in that whole area, has now been conquered and has been deported for not being obedient, for not keeping themselves pure, for not keeping God, Yahweh their God, as their supreme God and recognizing his authority over them for observing the Sabbath. By observing the Sabbath, by observing the every 7 years of giving the land rest. And what happened? They've been conquered. And evil came upon them. And why did that evil come upon them? Because they were disobedient. They had not observed the 7-year sabbatical, the Sabbath of letting the land rest, because they thought that's a waste of time. That's a waste of land. Why let it sit for a year when we can make more money? So they did not observe and honor God by giving the land its deserved rest. And that is why they were conquered. They did not honor God. And because they did not honor God, they were deported for 70 years. Why? Because 7 times 10 being that they did not observe the Sabbath, which was a 7. And so they're now going to pay for it for 10 times for 70 years. And so in other words, they are deported to Babylon, but for 70 years. And after 70 years, they will be allowed to return. But they must obey the Sabbath. They must obey what God has commanded them to. So what do we have now? We have a non-Western culture that has been conquered, that has been deported. And what has happened to it? Well, that's what we're going to see a little further on in the history of the two cultures. They'll be back. They don't disappear, which most cultures, when conquered and when deported, that's the end. They no longer exist. But this one will be back. This is the History of Two Cultures, lecture series number 3 out of 8. Thanks again for joining me. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. You can communicate with us through those addresses that are behind me here on the board. And thank you again. Thank you again for accompanying me, and hope to see you in the next series.